You know what keeps me up at night? It's not competition. It's not market share. It's watching one of the greatest companies ever built make the exact same mistake that killed Sears, Blockbuster, and Nokia. And right now, as I'm talking to you, Apple is sprinting full speed toward that cliff. I'm going to tell you something I've never said publicly before. 3 months ago, I had dinner with someone very close to Apple's board. What they told me made my blood run cold. But before I get to that, you need to understand why I'm the one person who can see this coming from a mile away. Because I almost made the same mistake myself back in 2004. Here's what nobody tells you about building a $2 trillion company. The thing that got you there will absolutely destroy you if you're not careful. Apple became the most valuable company on earth by doing one thing better than anyone else in history. They made products so good, so beautifully designed, so integrated into an ecosystem that customers would pay almost any price. That iPhone in your pocket, Apple makes more profit on that single device than most companies make in a year. Their margin on an iPhone Pro is around 60%. Think about that. For every $1,000 phone, they're pocketing $600. That's not a business. That's a printing press. And that's exactly the problem. Let me take you back to 1997. I'm in my garage and I'm packing books. My parents think I've lost my mind. I've just left a cushy job on Wall Street to sell books online. Books, the internet is this weird thing that makes screeching noises when you connect to it, and I'm betting everything on it. But here's what I understood that most people didn't. I wasn't building a bookstore. I was building a customer obsession machine. Every decision we made, every dollar we spent, every feature we built, it all came back to one question. Does this make the customer's life better? Apple used to ask that question. Steve Jobs was fanatical about it. But somewhere along the way, something changed. And I can pinpoint exactly when it happened. It was 2018. Tim Cook made a decision that I would never have made. Apple stopped reporting iPhone unit sales. They just stopped telling investors how many phones they were selling. Now, why would you do that? I'll tell you why. Because unit sales were flattening and Tim didn't want analysts obsessing over it. Instead, Apple pivoted the narrative to services revenue, iCloud, Apple Music, the App Store, Apple TV Plus, all those monthly subscriptions that keep charging your credit card whether you're using them or not. Now, I'm not against services revenue. At Amazon, AWS is our most profitable business. Services can be incredible. But here's the critical difference. AWS exists because customers desperately needed cloud computing infrastructure. We built it because they were begging for it. Apple's services exist because Apple needs recurring revenue to keep Wall Street happy. See the difference? One is customer obsession. The other is margin obsession. And margin obsession is cancer. Let me tell you what happened at a company most people have forgotten. Sears. In 1960, Sears was Amazon before Amazon existed. They had the catalog, they had the distribution network, they had customer trust. You could buy literally anything from Sears. A house, a car, clothes, tools. They were unstoppable. By 2000, they were dead. What killed them? They stopped focusing on customers and started focusing on profit margins. They cut costs, reduced staff, let stores deteriorate because the financial guys at headquarters were obsessed with quarterly earnings. Meanwhile, customers started shopping at Walmart and Target, where the experience was better. Then the internet came along and finished the job. Apple isn't dead. Don't misunderstand me. But they're making Sears' mistake in slow motion, and it's happening so gradually that most people don't see it. Let me show you exactly what I mean. In 2007, Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone. It cost $399 for the 8GB model. Adjusted for inflation, that's about $570 today. The iPhone 15 Pro Max, $1,199. The price has more than doubled in real terms. Now, you might say, Jeff, but it does so much more, and you're right. But here's the thing. The cost to manufacture these phones hasn't doubled. The bill of materials for an iPhone 15 Pro Max is around $550. So Apple is taking a $650 margin on a product whose components cost half that. I'm not saying that's wrong, by the way. If customers are willing to pay it, more power to Apple. But here's what worries me. They've become so addicted to those margins that they've stopped asking the critical question, what happens when someone offers comparable quality for half the price? And don't tell me that can't happen. I've seen it happen in every industry I've ever studied. Someone always comes along and offers more value for less money. Always. It's the most predictable force in business. I call it your margin is my opportunity. And right now, Apple's margins are screaming opportunity to every ambitious founder in Shenzhen, Seoul, and Bangalore. But the margins aren't even the biggest problem. The real mistake Apple is making is something far more subtle and far more dangerous. They've stopped innovating for customers and started innovating for revenue. Let me explain what I mean. When Apple introduced the iPhone, it was revolutionary. It changed everything. The iPad, revolutionary. The Apple Watch, revolutionary. AirPods, revolutionary. But what have they done lately? They removed the headphone jack so you'd buy AirPods. They changed the charging port from Lightning to USB-C because Europe forced them to, not because they wanted to make customers' lives easier. They've been working on a car for a decade and just canceled the project after burning billions of dollars. Their Vision Pro headset costs $3,500 and almost nobody's buying it. Meanwhile, they're squeezing every possible dollar out of their existing ecosystem. Want more iCloud storage? That'll be 99 cents a month. Want Apple TV Plus? $9.99. Apple Music? $10.99. Apple Fitness? $9.99. Apple Arcade? $6.99. Apple News Plus? $12.99. If you're a committed Apple user paying for all their services, you're spending $600 a year on subscriptions alone. That's on top of the $1,000 you just paid for your phone. This isn't customer obsession. This is customer extraction. And here's what really bothers me. Apple has the resources to change the world. They're sitting on more than $60 billion in cash. They generate over $100 billion in free cash flow annually. They could be solving massive problems: climate change, healthcare, education, space exploration. Instead, they're designing new emoji and adding a slightly better camera to the iPhone every year. That's not thinking big. That's thinking quarterly earnings. Now, I promised I'd tell you about that dinner conversation. The person I was talking to, someone who's been in Apple's inner circle for years, told me something that made my jaw drop. They said there's a civil war happening inside Apple right now. On one side, you have the hardware people, the designers and engineers who still believe in making insanely great products. On the other side, you have the finance people, the Tim Cook disciples who worship at the altar of operating margins and shareholder returns. And the finance people are winning. This person told me about a meeting that happened last year. The hardware team presented a radical new product concept, something that could have been as revolutionary as the iPhone. I can't tell you what it was, but trust me, it was big. The finance team killed it. Why? Because the projected margins were only 30%. 30%! Most companies would sacrifice their firstborn for 30% margins. But at Apple, if it's not 50% or higher, it doesn't get greenlit. That's insane. That's exactly how you stop innovating. You price out risk, you price out revolution, you become IBM. Let me tell you what we do at Amazon. We have a famous saying: we're willing to be misunderstood for long periods of time. When we launched Amazon Web Services, Wall Street hated it. Analysts said we were wasting money on a low-margin business that had nothing to do with retail. Our stock got hammered. But we didn't care because we knew customers needed it. Today, AWS generates more operating income than our entire North American retail business. We were right. The analysts were wrong. And we were right because we focused on customers, not margins. Apple used to think that way. When Steve launched the iPhone, plenty of people said it would fail. Too expensive. No keyboard. Who wants to touch a screen? But Steve didn't care because he knew it was better. Now Apple waits to see what the market wants before they move. They're becoming reactive instead of proactive. They're following instead of leading. And once you start following, you've already lost. Here's another thing that drives me crazy about Apple's current strategy. They're treating customers like they're locked in. And technically, they're right. If you've got an iPhone, an iPad, a MacBook, and an Apple Watch, switching to Android or Windows is a nightmare. Your photos are in iCloud. Your messages won't work on other devices. Your apps don't transfer. Your accessories are incompatible. Apple's ecosystem is like the most beautiful prison ever built. Once you're in, getting out is so painful that most people don't even try. But here's what Apple doesn't understand. That prison only works as long as the experience inside is better than the experience outside. The moment someone builds a comparable ecosystem that's open, that's cheaper, and that's easier to use, people will endure the pain of switching. I've seen it happen. People said nobody would ever leave AOL. People said nobody would ever leave Microsoft Office. People said nobody would ever leave BlackBerry. They were all wrong. When something better comes along, customers switch. It might take 5 years. It might take 10 years, but it happens. And I can see it coming. I can see the cracks forming. Young people, Gen Z, they don't have the same Apple loyalty that millennials do. They're more likely to buy Android phones. They're more comfortable with different platforms. They don't care about brand loyalty the way previous generations did. They care about value. And Apple is increasingly not offering value, they're offering luxury. And luxury is a dangerous business model when economic times get tough. Let me tell you about a metric I watched closely. Apple's growth rate in China. China used to be Apple's second largest market and their fastest growing market. But in the last 2 years, Apple's China sales have fallen. Why? Because Chinese brands like Huawei, Xiaomi, and Oppo are offering phones that are 90% as good as an iPhone for half the price. Chinese consumers are patriotic. They want to support local brands. And when the local brand is legitimately competitive, why pay double for an Apple logo? This is the canary in the coal mine. If Apple can lose China, they can lose anywhere. India, the next big growth market, never really embraced Apple in the first place. iPhones have single-digit market share there. Southeast Asia, same story. Africa, same story. Apple is increasingly becoming a Western luxury brand rather than a global technology leader. That's a problem when the future growth of technology is happening in emerging markets. But here's where it gets really interesting. Remember that mistake I almost made back in 2004? We were starting to make real money at Amazon. Our retail business was profitable. Wall Street was happy. And there was enormous pressure from our board and investors to focus on maximizing those retail profits. Raise prices a little, cut costs a little, optimize margins. It would have been so easy. We could have printed money for a few years, but I saw what would happen. We'd get comfortable. We'd get fat. We'd stop innovating. And then someone younger, hungrier, and smarter would come along and eat our lunch. So instead, we did something crazy. We took all those profits and invested them in two things that made no sense at the time: AWS, cloud computing infrastructure, and Amazon Prime, a subscription service where we'd give customers free shipping, which is insanely expensive. Both decisions were hated by analysts. Our margins collapsed. Our stock price stagnated. I got called into meetings where investors demanded to know what I was doing. But I kept coming back to the same principle. Customer obsession. Would AWS make customers' lives better? Absolutely. Would Prime make customers' lives better? Absolutely. So we did it. And both became massive businesses that define Amazon today. Apple is at that exact same crossroads right now. They can keep extracting maximum profit from their existing ecosystem, or they can take some of that profit and invest it in genuinely revolutionary products that might have lower margins but create massive new markets. So far, they're choosing extraction, and that's the mistake. Let me give you a concrete example of what I mean. Apple is reportedly working on an AI that will be integrated into iOS. Sounds great, right? But here's how they're thinking about it. They want to make it exclusive to their newest, most expensive phones. If you've got an iPhone 13, tough luck. You've got to upgrade to the iPhone 16 to get the AI features. Why? Because they want to drive upgrade cycles. They want to force people to buy new phones. Contrast that with how we think at Amazon. When we built Alexa, we wanted it on every device possible. Amazon devices, third-party devices, your car, your TV, everywhere. Why? Because the more people use Alexa, the more valuable the ecosystem becomes for everyone. We weren't trying to extract maximum profit from each device. We were trying to build the best voice assistant in the world and make it as accessible as possible. That's customer obsession. Now, you might be thinking, Jeff, you're being too hard on Apple. They're still incredibly successful. And you're right. They are. But success is the worst teacher. Success makes you think that what you're doing is right, that you don't need to change. I've seen it 1,000 times. Companies that are successful today but dead tomorrow because they didn't see the change coming. And the change is always the same. Someone offers more value for less money. Someone puts customers first instead of margins first. Here's what I think is going to happen over the next 5 years. I think we're going to see the rise of a new category of devices that blur the line between phones, computers, and AI assistants. They're going to be powered by advanced AI that's actually useful, not just gimmicky features. They're going to be open platforms where developers can build amazing things without asking permission or paying a 30% tax to a gatekeeper. And they're going to cost half what an iPhone costs. When that happens, and it will happen, Apple will have a choice. They can respond by lowering prices and opening their platform, or they can double down on luxury branding and ecosystem lock-in. I predict they'll choose luxury because that's what their entire business model is built on now. And that's when they'll start the long, slow decline. It won't be fast. It might take 10 or 15 years, but it'll happen. You know, it's funny. I genuinely hope I'm wrong about this. I have enormous respect for Apple. I use their products. I think they've built incredible technology, but respect doesn't mean blind faith. And right now, I see them making the same mistake that every dominant company eventually makes. They're optimizing for today instead of inventing the future. At Amazon, we have this concept called day one. It's the idea that every day should feel like the first day of a new company. Day one is nimble. Day one is customer focused. Day one is eager to learn and quick to adapt. Day two is the opposite. Day two is when you become slow, defensive, and obsessed with protecting what you have instead of building what comes next. Day two is the beginning of the end. Apple is in day two. They might not realize it yet. They're still profitable, still growing, still beloved by millions of customers. But the mentality has shifted. They're protecting the castle instead of exploring new continents. And once you're in day two, it's incredibly hard to get back to day one. Let me tell you about the single most important meeting I ever had at Amazon. It was 2008, and we were discussing Kindle pricing. The finance team wanted to price the Kindle at $499 to maximize margins. The device cost us around $250 to make, so $499 gave us excellent margins. But I said no. I said we're pricing it at $399, which was barely above cost. The finance people thought I was insane, but here's what I understood. The Kindle wasn't the business. Books were the business. If we could get millions of people reading on Kindle, they'd buy digital books for years. The device was the razor. The books were the blades. We needed to make the razor as affordable as possible to build the ecosystem. Apple understands this with AirPods and the Apple Watch. They're relatively affordable to get people into the ecosystem, but they've forgotten it with their core products. the iPhone, the Mac, the iPad. Those are priced for maximum extraction, not maximum adoption. And here's what really worries me about Apple's future. Their entire business model depends on people upgrading their phones every 2 or 3 years. But the improvements between phone generations are getting smaller. The iPhone 15 is marginally better than the iPhone 14, which was marginally better than the 13. At some point, customers are going to start asking, why am I spending another $1,000 for a phone that's only slightly better? And when they start asking that question, Apple's revenue model collapses. I saw this happen in the PC industry. In the 1990s, you had to upgrade your computer every 2 years because software kept getting more demanding. Then things plateaued. Computers from 5 or 6 years ago can still run modern software just fine. So people stopped upgrading. PC sales collapsed. The only companies that survived were the ones who adapted their business models. Dell went private. HP split itself in half. IBM got out of PCs entirely. Apple is about to face the same dynamic with phones. Now, here's the really fascinating part. Apple has the resources to avoid this fate. They could invest in genuinely new categories. They could buy companies that are doing innovative things. They could make big bets on emerging technologies, but they're not doing any of that at the scale they should. They make small acquisitions of teams and patents, sure, but they're not making big, bold moves. Why? Because big, bold moves are risky. And risk is the enemy of predictable quarterly earnings. You know what I love about Amazon? We're still making big, bold, risky moves. We're investing billions in Kuiper, our satellite internet constellation. Will it work? I don't know. We're investing billions in healthcare through Amazon Pharmacy and One Medical. Will it work? I don't know. We're investing billions in autonomous delivery and drone delivery. Will it work? I don't know. But we're trying. We're inventing. We're taking risks. Because that's what day one companies do. Apple used to be like that. The iPod was a huge risk. The iPhone was an even bigger risk. The iPad, the Apple Watch, AirPods, all risks. But what's the last big risk Apple took? The Vision Pro? That's a $3,500 headset with barely any software and almost no adoption. That's not a real bet. That's a science project. A real bet would be saying, we're going to make AR glasses that cost $200 and work seamlessly with every device you own. And we're going to subsidize them because we believe the future of computing is spatial and we need to win that market. But Apple won't do that because it would cannibalize iPhone sales, because it would require lower margins, because it would require patience and long-term thinking. And Apple doesn't have that anymore. They're trapped by their own success. They're prisoners of Wall Street's expectations. They have to deliver predictable, growing profits every single quarter. And that requirement is incompatible with genuine innovation. Here's something most people don't know. At Amazon, we have a famous memo that I wrote in the early 2000s. It's called the API mandate. I told every team at Amazon that they had to expose their services as APIs that other teams could use. If they didn't, they'd be fired. It seemed crazy at the time. Why would our retail team need to use APIs from our infrastructure team? But that decision, that mandate, led directly to AWS. Because we built internal tools that were so good, we realized other companies would pay for them. Apple needs that kind of radical thinking right now. They need someone to write a memo that says everything we build must be open, accessible, and customer first. If we're making a decision because it locks customers in or extracts more revenue, we need to rethink it. But that memo won't get written because Tim Cook isn't Steve Jobs, and he's not me. He's a brilliant operations guy who's incredible at optimizing existing business models. But he's not a visionary. He's not someone who can see around corners and bet the company on what comes next. And that brings me to the conversation I haven't told you about yet. The real reason I'm making this video. About 6 months ago, I was at a conference in Aspen. I won't tell you which one, but it's an event where the top CEOs and investors in the world gather to talk about the future. During a break, I was talking with someone who runs one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world. They manage hundreds of billions of dollars. And they told me something that made me sit up and pay attention. They said they've been quietly reducing their Apple position. Not dramatically, but steadily. Over the past 18 months, they've sold about 20% of their Apple shares. When I asked why, their answer was simple. They don't see where the next $1 trillion in market value comes from. Apple is at $3 trillion in market cap. To get to $4 trillion, they need to find new growth. And this investor doesn't see it. Services are growing, but they're approaching saturation. iPhone sales are flat. Mac sales are cyclical. iPad sales are declining. The Vision Pro is a flop. The car project is dead. Where's the growth? And here's the thing. This wasn't some random hedge fund manager or day trader. This was one of the largest, most sophisticated institutional investors in the world. These are the people who think in decades, not quarters. And they're losing faith in Apple's long-term trajectory. That should terrify Apple shareholders. Now, let me be clear. I'm not saying sell all your Apple stock tomorrow. Apple is still enormously profitable. They still have a loyal customer base. They're still generating massive cash flow. But I am saying that the golden age of Apple growth is over. And what comes next is not going to be pretty unless they fundamentally change their approach. So what should Apple do? If I were advising Tim Cook, here's what I'd tell him. First, cut prices aggressively. Make the base iPhone cost $500. Make the MacBook Air cost $600. Make the iPad cost $200. Yes, your margins will shrink. Yes, Wall Street will punish your stock in the short term, but you'll explode your user base, which is the foundation of everything else you do. Second, open up your platform. Let people install apps from anywhere, not just the App Store. Let developers use whatever payment systems they want. Drop the 30% commission to something reasonable, like 5 or 10%. Again, you'll take a short-term revenue hit, but you'll win developer loyalty, which is critical as AI and new computing paradigms emerge. Third, make a huge bet on AI. And I don't mean adding some gimmicky features to Siri. I mean actually building an AI assistant that's better than ChatGPT, better than Google's Gemini, better than anything else out there. Make it available on every device you sell, even old ones. Make it the best AI in the world and use it to cement your position as the technology leader. Fourth, kill products that aren't working. The Vision Pro isn't going to be a mainstream success at that price point. Either make it affordable or kill it and redirect those resources to something else. Same with all the products that are just incremental updates. If it's not genuinely better, don't ship it. Fifth, make a huge acquisition. Buy a company that's doing something revolutionary, whether that's in AI, robotics, healthcare, energy, whatever. But make a statement that Apple is still willing to take big swings. The last major acquisition Apple made was Beats in 2014 for $3 billion. That was 11 years ago. Amazon has made dozens of acquisitions in that time. We bought Whole Foods. We bought Ring. We bought MGM. We're constantly expanding into new territories. Apple needs to do the same. But here's what I know won't happen. Tim Cook won't do any of those things. Because Tim is a custodian, not a revolutionary. He's protecting Steve's legacy, not building his own. And that's fine for a while. But eventually, every company needs someone who's willing to blow things up and start over. Someone who's willing to cannibalize their own products before someone else does. Someone who cares more about customers than quarterly earnings. Steve Jobs was that person. He killed the iPod by creating the iPhone. He didn't care that it would destroy a profitable business. He knew it was the right thing for customers. That's the mentality that built Apple into what it is today. And that's the mentality that's completely absent from Apple's current leadership. So here's my prediction. Over the next 5 years, you're going to see Apple's growth slow dramatically. You're going to see their market share erode in key markets like China and India. You're going to see customers start to question whether the premium they pay for Apple products is worth it. And you're going to see Apple respond by focusing even more on services, revenue, and ecosystem lock-in, which will accelerate the erosion of goodwill. By 2030, I predict Apple will still be a valuable company, but they won't be the most valuable company anymore. Someone else, probably a company that doesn't even exist yet, will have surpassed them, because that company will be doing what Apple used to do, obsessing over customers, taking big risks, inventing the future. And the tragedy is that it didn't have to be this way. Apple has everything they need to maintain their dominance. They have the cash, they have the talent, they have the brand, they have the ecosystem. But what they don't have is the courage to change. And in technology, if you're not moving forward, you're moving backward. There's no standing still. I'll leave you with this thought. In my entire career, I've never seen a company die because they innovated too much or cared too much about customers, but I've seen dozens of companies die because they got comfortable, because they prioritized margins over mission, because they forgot why they existed in the first place. Apple is on that path right now. And unless something changes dramatically, we're watching the beginning of the end of one of the greatest companies in history. That dinner conversation I mentioned, the person told me one more thing before we parted ways. They said there's a group of senior people at Apple who know this is happening. They see the trajectory. They're trying to sound the alarm, but they're being overruled by the finance team and by Tim Cook himself. These people are frustrated, demoralized, and some of them are starting to leave. Brain drain is beginning at Apple. The most innovative minds are going to places where they can actually innovate. And that's the real canary in the coal mine. When your best people start leaving because they can't do their best work, that's when you know a company is in trouble. That's what happened at Microsoft in the 2000s. That's what happened at Yahoo. That's what happened at BlackBerry. The talent leaves before the company collapses. And by the time leadership realizes what's happening, it's too late. So I'm watching Apple very carefully over these next few years. I'm watching to see if they surprise me. I'm watching to see if Tim Cook can transform from custodian to revolutionary. I'm watching to see if they can rediscover the spirit that made them great. But I'm not optimistic, because changing culture is the hardest thing in business. And Apple's culture has shifted from insanely great to incredibly profitable. And once that shift happens, reversing it is nearly impossible. The question isn't whether Apple will make a mistake. They're already making it. The question is whether they'll realize it in time to do something about it. And based on everything I've seen, everything I've heard, and everything I know about how great companies decline, I don't think they will. I think they're going to ride this wave of profitability for another 5 or 10 years, and then they're going to wonder how they lost their way. And that's the tragedy. Because the world needs companies like Apple at their best. We need companies that push boundaries, that make products we didn't know we needed, that inspire us with their ambition. But Apple at their current trajectory, they're not that company anymore. They're just another luxury brand trying to extract maximum profit from a loyal customer base. And that's not enough to change the world. You want to know what really keeps me up at night? It's not that Apple is making this mistake. It's that they're making it in slow motion, and everyone's just watching it happen. It's like seeing a train wreck coming from miles away, and nobody's pulling the brake. Let me tell you why this matters so much. Not just for Apple, but for everyone watching this right now. Back in 2011, I was having lunch with Steve Jobs. This was about 6 months before he passed away. We were sitting outside at this restaurant in Palo Alto, and he was thinner than I'd ever seen him, but his mind was as sharp as ever. We were talking about competition, about Amazon and Apple, about where technology was heading. And Steve said something to me that I've never forgotten. He said, "Jeff, the thing that scares me most isn't that we'll make bad products. It's that we'll make good products that don't matter." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Apple was printing money. The iPhone was dominating. The iPad had just launched. Everything they touched turned to gold. But now, looking back, I realized Steve saw something coming. He saw that Apple could become so successful that they'd stop taking the risks that made them great in the first place. He saw that success itself could become the enemy. And he was right. Because here's what nobody talks about. The biggest risk isn't that Apple will fail spectacularly. It's that they'll succeed incrementally until they become irrelevant. They'll keep making profitable products that customers buy out of habit, not excitement. They'll keep hitting their earnings targets. Wall Street will keep applauding, and slowly, quietly, they'll stop mattering. You know what I see when I look at Apple's product announcements now? I see a company going through the motions. New iPhone, slightly better camera. New MacBook, slightly faster chip. New iPad, slightly thinner. Nothing revolutionary. Nothing that makes you stay up at night thinking about possibilities. Nothing that changes how you work or live or think. Just incremental improvements to milk the existing customer base for another year. Compare that to what's happening in AI right now. OpenAI releases ChatGPT, and suddenly millions of people are using AI in their daily lives. Google scrambles to integrate AI into search. Microsoft puts billions into OpenAI and integrates it into Office. Anthropic is pushing the boundaries of what AI can do. And Apple, they announced that Siri got slightly better at understanding accents. That's not innovation. That's embarrassing. Here's what really bothers me about Apple's AI strategy, or lack thereof. They have more cash than God. They have some of the smartest engineers in the world. They have billions of devices in people's hands that could be running AI. And yet, they're getting destroyed in AI by companies that are a fraction of their size. Why? Because AI requires a different mindset. It requires putting models in the cloud, collecting data, iterating rapidly, being willing to ship imperfect products and improve them over time. But Apple can't do that. They're obsessed with privacy, which is admirable, but it's also an excuse. They're obsessed with perfection, which sounds good, but it means they ship too slowly. They're obsessed with control, which means they can't tap into the open source AI community the way everyone else can. So while the rest of the tech world is racing ahead in AI, Apple is stuck in the past, trying to figure out how to make AI work within their walled garden. Let me tell you what this reminds me of. In the early 2000s, Microsoft dominated computing. Windows was on 95% of computers. Office was the standard for productivity. Internet Explorer was the dominant browser. Microsoft was invincible. And then the internet happened, and mobile happened, and cloud happened, and Microsoft missed all of it because they were too focused on protecting Windows and Office. They tried to force everything to work within their existing ecosystem instead of embracing the new paradigm. It took Microsoft almost 15 years to recover. They brought in Satya Nadella, who completely transformed the company's culture. They embraced open source. They embraced cloud. They embraced mobile, even though they'd failed at it before. And now Microsoft is thriving again. But they lost 15 years. 15 years where they could have been leading instead of following. Apple is making the exact same mistake right now with AI. They're trying to figure out how to make AI fit into their existing business model instead of letting AI transform their business model. And by the time they figure it out, if they ever do, they'll be years behind. The AI revolution will have happened without them. Now, let me tell you about something even more concerning. Apple's relationship with developers. Developers are the lifeblood of any platform. Without developers building great apps, your platform dies. Apple knows this. The App Store has millions of apps because developers spent hundreds of millions of hours building for iOS. But Apple has been systematically alienating developers for years now. The 30% commission? That's insane. Epic Games sued them over it. Spotify's been complaining for years. Even small developers who are making apps out of passion are getting crushed by Apple's fees. When you're a tiny startup and Apple takes 30% of your revenue, that's the difference between survival and death. But Apple doesn't care. They need that services revenue to keep Wall Street happy. The App Store review process? It's arbitrary and capricious. Apps get rejected for reasons that make no sense. Developers wait weeks for approval. And if Apple decides to build a feature that competes with your app, tough luck. They'll Sherlock you, meaning they'll build your feature into the operating system and destroy your business overnight. They did it to flashlight apps. They did it to calculator apps. They did it to countless productivity apps. Developers live in constant fear that Apple will decide their market is worth entering. And now, with AI, it's getting worse. Apple wants to control how developers use AI on iOS. They want all AI features to go through their frameworks. They want approval over what models can be used. This is crazy. AI is moving so fast that any approval process kills innovation. Developers need to be able to experiment, iterate, and ship quickly. Apple's control freak mentality is completely incompatible with the speed of AI innovation. So what's happening? The best developers are focusing on the web and on Android. They're building AI applications that don't need Apple's permission. They're creating products that work across platforms. And slowly, the iOS ecosystem is becoming less important. Not overnight, not dramatically, but steadily. And once developers stop prioritizing iOS, Apple's platform advantage erodes. You know what Amazon's relationship with third-party sellers is like? We give them the tools to succeed. We give them access to our logistics network, our payment processing, our customer base. Yes, we take a fee. But we're partners. We want them to succeed because their success is our success. When a third-party seller does well on Amazon, they sell more, which means more selection for customers, which means more customers, which means more sellers. It's a flywheel. Apple used to understand flywheels. More devices meant more developers, meant better apps, meant more devices. But they broke the flywheel by getting greedy. They started thinking of developers as revenue sources instead of partners. And now the flywheel is slowing down. Let me give you a specific example that illustrates everything wrong with Apple's current approach. Hey. You know about Hey? It's an email app that charges for their service. When Hey tried to launch on iOS, Apple rejected them unless they used Apple's in-app purchase system, which would give Apple 30%. But Hey's entire business was built around direct subscriptions. Apple didn't care. They wanted their cut, or Hey couldn't be on the App Store. This went public. There was a huge backlash. Apple eventually backed down a bit, but only because of the bad PR. But think about what they tried to do. They tried to force a company to completely change their business model just to be on iOS. That's not a partnership. That's extortion. And it tells you everything you need to know about Apple's current mentality. Now, let's talk about something that's going to sound controversial, but I believe it to my core. Apple's focus on privacy is hurting them. Before you get angry, let me explain. I'm not saying privacy doesn't matter. It absolutely matters. But Apple has turned privacy into a marketing gimmick and a competitive weapon, and it's backfiring. Apple runs ads saying they protect your privacy. Unlike those other guys, they position themselves as the privacy-focused alternative to Google and Facebook and Amazon. That's fine. Good marketing. But here's the problem. Being privacy-focused means you can't collect data. And if you can't collect data, you can't train AI models effectively. And if you can't train AI models, you lose in the AI era. Google has decades of search data. Facebook has decades of social data. Amazon has decades of shopping data. All of that data is fuel for AI. We can train models that understand what people want, what they're looking for, what problems they're trying to solve. Apple has decided not to collect that data in the name of privacy. So they're trying to fight an AI war with one hand tied behind their back. Now, you might say, Jeff, shouldn't we be glad someone is standing up for privacy? And yes, in principle, sure. But here's the reality. Most people don't actually care that much about privacy in practice. They say they care, but then they use Google, Facebook, TikTok, all of which collect massive amounts of data. People trade privacy for convenience and utility every single day. So Apple's privacy stance is morally admirable, but strategically stupid. They're sacrificing competitive advantage for a principle that most customers don't actually prioritize. And meanwhile, Their competitors are building better AI, better recommendations, better search, better everything, because they have the data to do it. At Amazon, we collect data, but we're transparent about it, and we use it to improve the customer experience. Recommendations on Amazon work because we know what you've bought and what you've looked at. Alexa gets smarter because we analyze voice interactions. AWS improves because we see how customers use our services. That's not evil. That's making better products. Apple could do the same thing. They could collect data responsibly with transparency and user consent and use it to make incredible AI products. But they've painted themselves into a corner with their privacy marketing. Now, if they start collecting data, they look like hypocrites. So they're stuck. And stuck is the worst place to be in technology. Let me tell you about another massive mistake Apple is making that almost nobody is talking about. Their pricing strategy in emerging markets. China, I already mentioned, they're losing ground fast, but India's even worse. India is about to become the largest smartphone market in the world. Over 1 billion people, young, tech-savvy population, rapidly growing middle class. This should be Apple's next big growth market. But Apple has single-digit market share in India. Single digits. You know why? Because an iPhone costs more than the average Indian worker makes in 3 months. Apple's cheapest phone in India costs around $600. Meanwhile, Xiaomi and Samsung sell perfectly good phones for $200 or less. For most Indians, buying an iPhone is not a purchasing decision, it's a fantasy. Apple's response? Make a cheaper phone? No. Open more stores? A few, sure. But fundamentally, they're treating India like a luxury market instead of a mass market. They're accepting single-digit market share because they don't want to lower prices and hurt their margins. This is insane. India's going to have 500 million smartphone users in the next few years. If Apple has 5% of that market instead of 50%, that's hundreds of billions in lost revenue over the next decade. But here's the really stupid part. Those Indian consumers who buy a cheap Android phone today, they're going to stick with Android. They're going to get used to the Android ecosystem. They're going to build their digital lives on Google's platform. And when they get wealthier and can afford more expensive phones, they're not going to switch to Apple. They're going to buy a nicer Android phone. Apple is losing an entire generation of Indian customers because they're too greedy to offer affordable products. We made the opposite bet at Amazon. When we entered India, we didn't try to maximize margins. We invested billions in infrastructure. We hired tens of thousands of people. We adapted to local needs. We built payment systems that work for Indian consumers. We created a platform that small Indian businesses could use to reach customers. And now Amazon India is a massive business that's growing rapidly. We understood that you invest in emerging markets, you don't extract from them. Apple doesn't get this. They're still thinking like a luxury brand instead of a technology platform. And luxury brands don't win in mass markets. Utility wins, value wins, accessibility wins. Apple is choosing to be Gucci when they should be trying to be Toyota, and that choice is going to cost them the future. Here's another trend I'm watching that should terrify Apple: the rise of super apps. In China, WeChat is everything. It's messaging, payments, social media, shopping, transportation, everything. You live your entire digital life inside WeChat. In Southeast Asia, Grab and Gojek are becoming super apps. They started as ride-hailing, but now they're payments, food delivery, shopping, financial services. The super app model is incredibly powerful because it creates lock-in at the software level, not the hardware level. If your entire life is in WeChat, you don't care whether you have an iPhone or an Android phone. The phone is just the window to WeChat. The platform that matters is the software platform, not the hardware platform. Apple's entire business model is based on hardware lock-in. They want you to buy an iPhone, then an iPad, then a Mac, then an Apple Watch, and have everything synced together beautifully. But if the super app becomes more important than the operating system, that whole model collapses. Suddenly, the iPhone is just a commodity screen that runs WeChat or whatever the dominant super app is. This is already happening in China. Chinese consumers are less loyal to iPhone than consumers anywhere else because WeChat is the platform that matters. Apple is just the hardware underneath. And as super apps spread to other markets, and they will, Apple's hardware lock-in becomes less valuable. Apple should be building a super app themselves. They should be integrating messages, FaceTime, Apple Pay, Apple Maps, App Store, everything into one seamless experience that's so good people can't imagine leaving. But they're not doing that. They're keeping everything siloed, probably because different executives control different products and don't want to give up their kingdoms. Classic big company dysfunction. Meanwhile, there are dozens of startups working on the next super app for Western markets. Maybe it's built on AI, maybe it's built on crypto, maybe it's built on something we haven't imagined yet, but someone is going to crack it. And when they do, Apple's ecosystem advantage evaporates. Let me tell you about a conversation I had with a 22-year-old entrepreneur last month. Brilliant kid, MIT, computer science, already sold a company. He's starting something new in AI. And I asked him what phone he uses. He showed me his Android. I asked why not iPhone? And his answer was fascinating. He said, iPhones are for old people. Everyone he knows who's building cool stuff uses Android because it's more open, more hackable, more friendly to developers who want to push boundaries. Now, this is just one person, but it's a signal. When the smartest young technologists think your product is for old people, that's a problem. That means you're losing the leading edge of innovation. That means the future is being built on platforms other than yours. And once you lose the developers, once you lose the cutting edge, you're in trouble. Apple used to be the cool brand. Steve Jobs made technology sexy. The iPhone was aspirational. Everyone wanted one. But brands age. What was cool to millennials isn't necessarily cool to Gen Z. And Gen Z sees Apple as their parents' brand. They're not necessarily excited about it. They're not loyal to it the way previous generations were. And Apple isn't doing anything to win them back. Their marketing is stale. Their products are predictable. Their stores are boring. There's no excitement, no danger, no sense that Apple is doing something revolutionary. They're just the safe, reliable, expensive option. And safe, reliable, and expensive doesn't win in the long run. You know, what does win? Surprising people, delighting people, making them feel like they're part of something bigger than themselves. That's what Apple did with the iPhone launch. People camped outside stores. There was genuine excitement. When was the last time people got genuinely excited about an Apple product? AirPods? Maybe? In 2016? That was 9 years ago. Everything since then has been incremental. The Apple Watch is fine. The AirPods Pro are fine. The Vision Pro is interesting but too expensive. Nothing has captured the cultural imagination the way the iPod, iPhone, and iPad did. And without that cultural momentum, you're just another tech company selling gadgets. Here's what I think is going to be the final nail in the coffin for Apple's current strategy: regulation. Governments around the world are finally waking up to the fact that Apple's App Store is a monopoly. The EU is forcing Apple to allow third-party app stores. They're forcing Apple to allow alternative payment systems. They're forcing Apple to open up their ecosystem. Apple is fighting this tooth and nail because they know it threatens their services revenue. But they're going to lose. The regulatory momentum is too strong. Within 5 years, iOS is going to be a much more open platform, whether Apple likes it or not. And when that happens, their 30% tax goes away. Their lock-in weakens. Their services revenue growth stalls. Apple's response should be to get ahead of this. Open up voluntarily, make opening up a competitive advantage rather than something they're forced to do. But they won't. They'll fight until they're forced to change. And then they'll comply with the minimum necessary to avoid fines. That's a loser's mentality. At Amazon, when we see regulation coming, we try to shape it in a way that works for customers. We engage constructively. We don't just fight and delay, because we know that fighting the future is a losing battle. Better to embrace change and turn it to your advantage. Now, I want to talk about something that's going to sound harsh, but it needs to be said. Tim Cook needs to step down. He's been CEO for 13 years. He's done an incredible job in many ways. He took the company from 200 billion in market cap to 3 trillion. He managed the supply chain brilliantly. He navigated trade wars and pandemics. He's a talented executive, but he's not the right person to lead Apple into the next era. He's not a product visionary. He's not someone who can inspire people with a bold vision of the future. He's not someone who's going to make the hard, risky decisions necessary to reinvent Apple for the AI age. He's a caretaker. And what Apple needs now is a revolutionary. Steve Jobs knew this. Before he died, he told the board not to ask, what would Steve do? He told them to do what's right, not what he would have done. But I don't think he envisioned Tim staying CEO for nearly 15 years. I think he expected Tim to eventually hand it off to someone younger, someone with product vision, someone who could take Apple in new directions. But that hasn't happened. And the longer Tim stays, the more calcified Apple becomes, the more the culture shifts toward operations and finance and away from product and innovation, the harder it becomes to change course. Tim should announce a succession plan. He should find someone who can be Apple's Satya Nadella, someone who can transform the culture while respecting what made Apple great. But I don't think he will, because stepping down requires admitting that change is needed. And Tim doesn't think change is needed. He looks at the financials and sees success. He doesn't see the slow erosion of Apple's competitive position because the numbers still look good, but by the time the numbers look bad, it'll be too late. Let me tell you what I'd do if I were Apple's CEO. Day one, I'd announce that we're cutting iPhone prices by 30%. Yes, margins would shrink. Yes, Wall Street would panic. But we'd explode market share, especially in emerging markets. We'd get hundreds of millions of new customers into the ecosystem. That's the foundation for everything else. Day two, I'd announce that the App Store commission is dropping to 10% and we're allowing alternative payment systems. We'd make this a positive. We'd say we're empowering developers because we believe in a thriving ecosystem. Wall Street would hate it, but developers would love it. And that's what matters long term. Day three, I'd announce a $5 billion investment in AI research with partnerships with the leading AI labs. We'd acknowledge that we're behind in AI and we're going all in to catch up. We'd make it the company's top priority. Every product would get AI features and we'd ship them fast, even if they're not perfect. Day four, I'd announce we're buying Figma or Notion or some other company that's doing revolutionary things in productivity software. We'd make a statement that Apple is acquiring its way into new markets and new capabilities. We'd spend $20 or $30 billion on a strategic acquisition that opens new opportunities. Day five, I'd reorganize the company. I'd break down the silos. I'd empower the young innovators. I'd make it clear that the old way of doing things is over. We're going back to day one. We're going to be uncomfortable. We're going to take risks. And we're going to invent the future. Would my stock price crater? Absolutely. I'd probably lose $1 trillion in market cap in the first month. Wall Street would call for my head. Analysts would downgrade Apple to sell. But you know what? I wouldn't care, because I'd be playing the long game. And in 5 years, we'd be positioned to dominate the next era of technology instead of clinging to the last one. But that's not going to happen, because Apple's board isn't going to hire someone like me. They're going to hire another operations person, another safe choice, another caretaker, and the slow decline will continue. Here's what I want you to understand. This isn't about hating on Apple. I genuinely admire what they've built. I use their products. I respect their achievements. But admiration doesn't mean blind loyalty. And right now, Apple needs people who love them enough to tell them the truth. The truth is, they're on the wrong path. You know what the saddest part of all this is? It's completely avoidable. Apple has every advantage. They have the resources, the talent, the brand, the customer base. They could dominate the next 50 years of technology if they made the right choices. But they're making the wrong choices. They're choosing short-term profits over long-term positioning. They're choosing safety over boldness. They're choosing incrementalism over revolution. And in 10 years, people are going to look back and ask, how did Apple blow it? They had everything going for them. And the answer will be simple. They got comfortable. They forgot that staying still is moving backward. They forgot that in technology, you're either disrupting or being disrupted. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've seen dozens of companies rise and fall. IBM, Microsoft, Nokia, BlackBerry, Yahoo, AOL, MySpace, all of them were dominant. All of them seemed invincible. All of them made the same mistake. They stopped obsessing about customers and started obsessing about their own success. They built walls to protect what they had instead of bridges to what comes next. Apple is making that mistake right now. And unlike some of those other companies, it's happening slowly enough that people aren't noticing, but it's happening. The brain drain, the developer alienation, the market share erosion in key markets, the loss of the cool factor, the regulatory pressure, the AI deficit. All of these are warning signs. All of these are telling us that Apple's dominance is not eternal. So what should you do if you're an Apple shareholder? That's up to you. I'm not giving financial advice, but I'll tell you what I'd do. I'd watch very carefully over the next 2 years. I'd watch to see if Apple makes any bold moves. I'd watch to see if they surprise me. I'd watch to see if they show any sign of understanding the danger they're in. If they do, if they pivot, if they take some of the steps I've outlined, then maybe there's hope. Maybe they can reinvent themselves the way Microsoft did. But if they keep doing what they're doing, if they keep prioritizing margins over mission, if they keep playing it safe, then I'd be looking for the exit. Because the writing is on the wall. You know what I've learned about great companies? They're not great because they never make mistakes. They're great because they recognize mistakes quickly and correct them aggressively. IBM made mistakes, then brought in Lou Gerstner, who completely transformed them. Microsoft made mistakes, then brought in Satya Nadella. Even Amazon has made plenty of mistakes. The Fire Phone was a disaster. Some of our acquisitions haven't worked out, but we recognize our failures, we learn from them, and we move on. The question is, can Apple do that? Can they recognize that their current strategy is failing before it's too late? Can they bring in leadership that's willing to disrupt their own business model? Can they rediscover the courage that made them great? I don't know. But I hope so, because the world is better with a great Apple than without one. Let me end with this. Steve Jobs once said, "Stay hungry, stay foolish." That was his advice for anyone trying to do great work. Stay hungry means never being satisfied, always wanting to do better. Stay foolish means being willing to take risks that other people think are crazy. That mentality built Apple into the greatest technology company in history. But somewhere along the way, Apple stopped being hungry and stopped being foolish. They got satisfied, they got careful, they got predictable. And that's the real mistake I'm talking about. Not any single decision, but the cumulative effect of choosing safety over boldness, incrementalism over revolution, comfort over hunger. If Apple wants to avoid the fate of every other dominant tech company that came before them, they need to get hungry again. They need to get foolish again. They need to be willing to cannibalize their own products, disrupt their own business model, and take risks that terrify their board and shareholders. They need to remember that the goal isn't to preserve today's success, but to invent tomorrow's success. And if they can't do that, if they're too comfortable, too risk-averse, too focused on quarterly earnings, then they're going to join Sears and Nokia and BlackBerry in the corporate graveyard. Not this year. Maybe not even this decade, but eventually. Because in technology, The only constant is change. And companies that stop changing start dying. I'm Jeff Bezos, and I build companies that obsess over customers, take huge risks, and think in decades, not quarters. I've watched a lot of great companies lose their way. And right now, I'm watching it happen to Apple. I hope I'm wrong. I genuinely do. But based on everything I've seen, everything I know, and everything I've learned in 40 years of building businesses, I don't think I am. The question isn't whether Apple will make a huge mistake. They're making it right now, in slow motion, one safe decision at a time. The question is whether they'll realize it in time to change course. And that question is going to be answered over the next 5 years. Watch carefully, because what happens to Apple will determine the shape of the technology industry for decades to come. And remember, if you're building a company, if you're making decisions about your own business, don't be Apple. Don't choose comfort over courage. Don't choose margins over mission. Don't choose predictability over boldness. Stay hungry, stay foolish, and never, ever forget that your job is to invent the future, not protect the past. That's the only way to build something that lasts. That's the only way to build something that matters. Thank you.